Good morning. How are you?
Hi, John. How are you today? Where are you today?
I am at our world headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut, and it's a beautiful day here in Stamford. Where are
Well,
you?
the sun actually came out today in London. First time in a few days. It did rain a bit, but it's brightly shining now. So it sounds like we both have a wonderful day ahead of us.
We have a wonderful day ahead of us. That's awesome. And we've got a great guest today. We're going to have a great show. Really interesting. We've got Estes, the CIO, Todd Florence, on the show today. And they are the largest privately held shipping company in North America. And some of the stuff we're going to learn today with our guests and our audience is absolutely astonishing. We're going to learn more about how things get from A to B than we've ever thought we would know. So I'm super excited. And with that, let's get Todd on the show.
Excellent.
Hey, Todd.
Hey, everybody. Good
Hi,
morning.
Todd.
I think John oversold things a little bit, but we'll be okay. I don't know if everyone out there listening knows that, but like I get to hear the opening, so I was kind of chuckling. I'm like, so let the bar a little lower as we go forward, John.
That's it. No, Todd, we're excited about this. So, Todd, maybe a little quick background on kind of how you got into Estes, the firm and the shipping company and your role there, real quick.
Well, so as you were saying, I'm the CIO here at Estes. Prior to here, I'd probably spent about 20 years in consulting, like across a bunch of different industries, had done some work with Estes, had a lot of respect for the company. And quite frankly, the former CIO was leaving and he called me and he said, you should talk to Webb, whose last name happens to be Estes. And, a few months later in the most dynamic time on earth, I started in May of 2020. So like I come into an industry that's right on the verge of like, we don't know what's going to happen because everything had fallen off for like 30 days. And then it turned and went like this because everybody did the only sensible thing they could do. They stayed home and bought lots of things. So those things have to get to their house. But what I tell the leadership here is the reason that it grew so fast is because they hired me.
Well, of course. What else could it possibly be?
Now, Ola and I we love acronyms in our industry. We love them. We use them all the time. So LTL.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about shipping and what LTL means.
So it's a piece of the industry, right? Like, so if I talk about like the post office, right? Like everybody understands that. That's called parcel. That's like letters, small packages, those sorts of things, right? And then everybody's used to seeing tractor trailers on the road. Right. Yeah. These big 53-foot, we have those too, but everybody sees these big 53-foot trailers and you hear truckload, which means I filled that entire thing and sent it from point A to point B. In LTL, less than a truckload, it's all of the, and I'll get the numbers wrong and I'm certain both of you will correct me, but there's something like 60% of the US economy is small businesses. Well, they don't need 53 feet worth of freight. So you need this ability to take things that are too big to fit in your mailbox and aren't a full trailer and still move those around the country. And it sounds simple, but it's wonderfully complicated to take all of that less than a truckload stuff and move it efficiently across the country.
Wow. So one of the things about this, it feels like the back of your trucks is like a Tetris game.
It is.
And you've got to kind of get all the blocks in because every inch by inch in that truck is worth something, right? So if there's air in there, then you're spending money on moving air from A to B and not a widget, right? Is that kind of the example?
Yeah, the most expensive stuff we move is air, like to be honest, right? Like so if you think about it, and I don't know if you've shared this on the show before, but I know John, your wife has a small business. You guys like have that coffee business, and you are a customer of LTL shipments.
Yeah.
Right. Like it wouldn't be cost effective for you or for us if that one pallet of coffee you get in your shop a week, like went on a full trailer by itself.
Yeah.
Right. It also isn't sustainable, right? Like it's not good environmental stewardship.
Yeah.
So we start every day, like there's lots of different analogies around it and none of them are quite perfect. But one of the things we'll say is we pick up about anywhere from 55 to 65,000 shipments a day. And those shipments then have various numbers of pieces to them. So if you assume it's about 120 to 130,000 pieces of freight a day, And people will use airline analogies, right? Like, and now we got to move all this stuff around the country and get it to where it needs to be. We go through hubs just like they do. We do all that stuff. The difference is, like the three of us are all different shapes and sizes. When an airline, you could buy a different class of service, but we all get the same seat.
Yeah.
And in trucking, that's not true because those different pieces, one might be a kayak, one might be like a treadmill, one might be 10 pallets of coffee, right? Like, and the other thing is we don't have reservations like the airline does. So that 130,000 pieces that we're trying to figure out of how we're going to pick them up and start moving them across the country, like it's kind of like having a jigsaw puzzle with no picture and nothing on the pieces. And you got to figure it out every day on the fly across the entire country.
Wow.
So like we're building that puzzle or that Tetris game in each trailer, and we have north of 40,000 trailers on a daily basis. So the hope is you pick up about 55, 60,000 shipments a day and you deliver about that many. So the network stays about the same, but across the network, you know, some things take 2, 3, 4, 5 days to get from maybe a Richmond, Virginia, which is where I am, to like a Los Angeles, California. Like there's like we're only allowed to drive so fast, and we're only allowed to drive so many hours. So moving those things across the country, we end up with, I don't know, let's call it 400,000 pieces of freight, 500,000 pieces of freight on any given day in our network that we're managing and responsible for. That has
so it seems to me, Todd, that just brings to my mind technology, data, like routing, weight, customer experience, driver experience. Like all of a sudden, technology becomes what I can almost see in my head, an almost requirement for you to be able to get that job done.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about how you're using technology across what is essentially a really complicated supply chain. It's so complicated. I can't even, again, Tetris is probably a really good example. It's so complicated. How do you even do that?
Well, I describe it as fascinating, right? Like, because it's a very simple thing in most people's minds. You pick something up over here and you deliver it over there. Like, right? But we've got this network of terminals, like 220-ish terminals across the country where we're moving all of this freight through. So we've got 7,000 dock workers, 10,000 drivers. Some of those drivers are working in the city, running around, picking all this stuff up and delivering all this stuff. And some of them are working in our line haul network, moving that freight between our terminals, right? So you're not wrong, Ola. So when you start thinking about that, one of the things that we're building towards is building a digital twin of that whole thing. Right? Because the way this works, whether you're focused on our sustainability goals, we're focused on our profitability goals, we're focused on our customer service goals, is the best way to solve all of those is to use all of those assets very efficiently. So we're going through and we like when the drivers pick up the freight, the first time they see it, right? Like we're either leveraging EDI, API, website entered information, or driver entered information to determine what are the characteristics of that shipment. And that's kind of first pass. Like it comes back to our turn, and they're doing that on handheld devices. We're doing it through those other integrations and connectivity. We also run that through an optimization engine to make sure they're driving the most efficient route, to use the least gas, to meet customer demands, to make sure we've got space on those pickup trailers, right? And that's just like picking something up, right? And then we run that through another optimization engine that looks at what is the most effective way to build that Tetris game in our line haul trailers as we move it across the country, right? That then feeds into systems that tells our dock workers, well, what order do I have to load that in? How do I have to stack it? Can I stack it? And then you throw in things like, is it hazardous? Is it poisonous? Can it, like, you can't put like, you know, the old like fables of like, you can't put the fox and the chicken in the boat at the same time kind of a thing. And then you want their routes optimized, and then you're doing the inverse of the thing on the back end. And then as I always thank everybody for staying home and buying everything, customer demand has also changed. So customers have gotten very used to a high touch, high data experience. So we need to make sure that data is available in near real time to our customers so they know where their shipment is. Quite frankly, we dimension all of that freight because it helps us load better and it helps us know what we're moving. We also weigh all of that freight when it comes into our network. So if that's different than what the customer thought it was, we have to tell them that because it changes their bill, right? Like, so there's all of this communication that occurs. So working towards that digital twin then allows me to take all of that stuff and start modeling it against what might be a better way in an industry, quite frankly, that's operated for decades this way.
Yeah.
So it's like there's a fascinating amount of problems to go solve, and like then we can start playing whack-a-mole with technologies, right? Like we've got mobile, we've got I probably have 70,000 IoT devices. We've got cognitive and mostly cognitive right now, but also exploring generative AI solutions that we're using to move that freight. We've got a network of partners because we're doing all of that with an IT staff between contract partners and my employees of about 400 people, right? Supporting an organization of 23,000 employees. So lots of pieces. We need lots of help. It's a big ecosystem. But I'm not sure. I feel like I'm talking too much now. So I want to stop and let you ask questions.
No, it's actually incredibly fascinating because I think most of us recognize that there's something behind us getting that package delivered to our front door, or in the case of John's coffee shop, getting that pallet of very important, coffee delivered to his store. That's really important. And I think people who are in those situations sort of recognize that there's data underneath that because they know when it gets shipped, right? They know when they purchase it, they know when it gets shipped, and they know when it shows up. I think what's fascinating is that the way that happens is you're making that data relevant in real time. And I think that's what's really different. What used to be, and I know this because I worked for quite some time with a smaller logistics company, much smaller than you, but still it was a logistics company. And part of what you did 10 years ago, 15 years ago, was you knew the time that it left and you knew the time it arrived. And you really didn't know what was going on in between, right? And you didn't have the opportunity, as an example, if you were, because it's not A to B, it's A to B to B to C to C to D to D to D, right? You have all these different stops, and on all the different stops, you may be dropping off and picking up. And so you have this continual movement of asset or whatever it is that you're shipping that's needing to be relevant to where it is at that moment, not just from the begin point to the end point. And that's a digital twin just makes perfect sense to me, because not only do you have the opportunity to kind of have that real live data that's happening, but to your point, and I loved your point, you can predict. You can say, what happens if I do this? What happens if I change this parameter and do this a little differently instead? What does that do to my ability to sustainably move product around the nation? No, I think it's absolutely fascinating.
And I think you're being a little generous too, although when you're saying 10, 15 years ago, like I when you were talking, I went like this. That was,
you were like 2 years ago.
Yeah,
like 2 years ago.
2 to 5 years ago, right? Like,
yeah, you're probably right.
And it's an industry that, like, I think not a lot of people paid attention to, right? And then it was a lot of reports. And like one of the things I always say is, well, I can't manage yesterday. So a report only tells me what's already happened. So we've got to move into what's happening right now. So like when you look at our pickup systems and those things like that, we've won awards for the pickup system. We're now doing the same thing, right? Like driver is going to be there in 5 stops, right? Which was a thing that didn't really exist in our space because it was B2B. It was a little paper heavy. The integrations didn't exist. COVID helped accelerate all of that, but like I just think, quite frankly, the growth in the e-commerce space is accelerating that and changing customer demands. Like customers are generally okay, kind of at some level with whatever happens, as long as you're telling them. Like I think before when John and I were talking a little bit about the coffee shop, right? Like inevitably when things are this complex, something is going to have an issue. He just needs to know. Right? Like, well, I don't want to advertise that coffee because I'm not going to have it for 2 days. Or like, oh crap, like 3 pallets showed up, not 1. Or like, where do I store it? Like those sorts of things.
Todd, and for people that are listening, maybe digital twin has now been talked about for a few years. Ola, Where are you seeing industry going? I mean, this is such a great application to your point. Are there other hot spots for digital twin that you're starting to see, medical, other areas? What are your thoughts on that?
I think a lot of people took the recognition that digital twin for the longest time has been thought of in the industrial space and the manufacturing space, where people could look at what was either a dangerous environment or hard to get to environment and said, well, if I had a data that represented it in a twin-like manner, I could, I could test, or I could almost run a theory or a hypothesis about if I changed the process, what would the outcome potentially be?
Yeah.
That was originally kind of what the whole theory behind digital twin was. But I think what people started seeing almost immediately was, well, wait a minute. It's good for anything where I have a process, a route, anything that moves. I need the ability to be able to predict. And my easiest and best way to predict is to be able to get as real-time data as much as possible. In most cases, you don't really have real-time data. So you're getting data that's a month old. You're looking at the data and you're sort of projecting it based on what happened in the past. I think what's fascinating about today's world is we're seeing digital twin become much more, I guess, almost like a closer twin than what it used to be, right? Yeah. It's now become where it's actually so close to reality that I am predicting maybe a couple of steps ahead, where I used to predict maybe 6 months ahead. Yeah. I'm now able to predict a couple of steps ahead. And supply chain is the area that's important, is probably the most important place where digital twin could be applied. But Todd brings up a really important point. And that is the digital twin doesn't work without digital thread or data. It needs data. And the real issue that you get into is that a supply chain in and of its nature is not one company. I mean, you have to think about, they're picking up data from and product
disparate locations,
1,000 different companies who have a different way of describing what they're giving you on that pallet or what they're giving you to ship. So you've got a different order taking mechanism. By the way, I'm sure even today, 90% of it's probably still handwritten on a form, right? That I hand to the driver and say, here's what I'm giving you. So I think what's the next big change that's probably going to happen is probably the application of things like generative AI and those sorts of things to take what are really cumbersome start processes and end processes that are actually beyond, in the case of Estes, beyond Todd's control. And yet he needs that data. He needs that information to help his digital twin be able to function. And similarly, I can see where, like a routing mechanism, if I'm trying to figure out the best route for my driver to take, part of that needs data from the traffic, right? So there are other pieces of data that I can actually push into my digital twin or attach to that digital thread that gives me closer to real-time data, so that when I'm making those predictions of what I should do next or what's going to happen next, I have the right data within that digital twin to be able to appropriately predict it. So it's really both things. One doesn't work without the other. And, I can make it work. I'm sure within your ecosystem, Todd, you're getting it to the point where your data is ubiquitous. Your data is everywhere where you control your data. But I'm going to presume your biggest problem is probably outside of your boundary, where the data is either coming in or the data needs to go back out.
Well, and I would add you're not wrong, and I would add a couple of things to that, right? Like, so you start thinking about data is only accurate as accurate as it is, right? At some level, and it shifts and it changes and it does those things. So now I've got IoT devices, right? Like, so you talked about routing as an example, like the IoT device, instead of me predicting where the driver should be based on where he was and where he's headed or where she's headed, I now know where that equipment is, right? Like within 5 minutes, I know exactly where that thing is. So I have that data. We're investing in, here was a thing that was stupid hard and still seems to be stupid hard for a technology that's been around forever. OCR. Because you hit on it, right? Like, OCR is wonderfully simple if you have a standard form.
Yeah.
I don't know John, you've seen them. Oh, I don't know the last time you saw a bill of lading. I think we may have 10,000 different versions of bills of lading that come in. Now, thank God they're not all paper, right? Like, customers are getting more sophisticated. Our integrations are better. We're building better piping, all those sorts of things. But like, somebody hand writes it and writes it in the wrong box, right? And it's like, now I need an AI engine that can be like, this is what that really means, right? Like, so those things get difficult. And some of it is just about integrating tech that's been around for a very long time, right? And stop using the paper to make that data available. And a lot of it is being able to adjust as it's happening, right? So when we first started talking internally, and you're absolutely right, Ola, I stole it completely from Industry 4.0, right? Like looking at like the airline or the airplane and car manufacturers and what they were doing, and I'm like, oh, this thing's got lots of applications, lots of places. And it was originally of how do I coach that person to do that differently in the moment as it's happening?
Yeah.
And that's what everybody gets excited about. Like, how do I make sure that goes where it's supposed to go, and how do I coach that person? I still think the broader value is in where you were heading is I can now pull that up, model the whole system. And that modeling effort allows us such vast improvement for kind of everybody in the ecosystem that I think ultimately, as we put all these Lego pieces together, that's where the biggest value will be. And it's not just us at that point.
This is fabulous. Think about this too, is you're a freight company, so you're not in the technology creation business. So I don't think you have a team of 1,000 engineers in the basement, working on this. So you have to rely on partners and technology. Tell us a little bit how you leverage, firms. I think you utilize Coforge and others. How do you leverage kind of outside resources to help make some of the magic happen that you want to happen in your business?
Yeah, in lots of different ways, quite frankly, John. Like you mentioned Coforge. So we partner with them on IP, right? Like, and we're trying to develop some things that like ultimately they own and they can go sell and they can do that stuff. Like, we've partnered with them on other IP, right? Like that maybe we've developed something and then they get. We also like there's the hands and arms and legs kind of aspect of that business as well, because to be fair, like if I let without me being here and smiling so well at Ola, like she might tell you how wonderfully behind this industry is viewed, right? Well, sometimes when you're trying to hire in the industry from a technology perspective, and they hear things like mid-range, mainframe, AS400, lots of paper, green screens, like it might not always be the easiest to attract kind of high-end tech talent, right? Like, and I think people slept on us a little bit and didn't see the like AI, IoT, the investment. So there's been a lot of partnership development, and I mean true partnership, like sharing IP and doing lots of other things in those spaces to help both of us out. Quite frankly, I do a lot of these things. One, because if you haven't figured it out, I can talk. Two, it helps me hire. Like, let me get the message out of like, here's all like, yeah, like I'm going to bash somebody. I spent 20 years in financial services doing consulting, right? Like, and they're thought of differently than say shipping and logistics is thought of. I'm like, here you get like, I have real things to play with. Like, you want to go play with 70,000 IoT sensors and all of the data that they generate every 2 to 15 minutes? Like, I got them, right? Like, and now make sense out of that data and solve a real world problem that hits at things like environmental, societal, anyway, the sustainability issues, the green initiatives, those sorts of things, as well as profitability and moving things through the supply chain. But you're right, like LTL also, as you started this off, John, people don't know what it is.
Yeah.
It is a piece of the overall supply chain. It is not the largest piece of the supply chain. So you don't see as much vendors writing specific LTL packages.
Yeah.
So we've developed partnerships with lots of folks to encourage them, being one of the largest providers, to encourage them to be in this market, and help them bring their product to other markets as well. Otherwise,
and Ola, a question for you is when you think about kind of third-party, technology firms like a Coforge, et cetera. I mean, it seems like Todd and his team are leveraging them very strategically with IP and everything else. It's not just arms and legs of, hey, here's the instructions, do these things. How do you see the industry evolving? There are other firms doing as well with regards to what Estes doing in leveraging these service providers, or is this ahead of the game, you think?
I mean, I'm going to say it's a real mixed bag. I think Estes seems like it has gotten a really pragmatic approach to it, recognized that it had a very unique needed to have some, brilliant partners to come in and help it do some things. And probably like most companies, and manufacturing is another really good kind of example of saying, it's not like I'm sure somebody just has a giant bucket of money to say, just go throw everything away that you have today and go replace it with this new wonderful thing. Like nobody has that. You've got to do this in sort of a more integrated way, I guess, with what you already have. You're going to still have the AS400s. You're still going to have the mainframes. You're still going to have the green screens for some period of time. If you think about, manufacturing, again, they love to bleed their assets anyway until they pretty much, melt down to whatever. So I think that is probably, that mentality is not something that I see everywhere. Yeah. A lot of times what I see is organizations who think, I can't do it unless it's everything all at once. They're still trying to get this big bang thing through their head where, even though we're saying, a lot of us in the industry are saying just what Todd is doing, which is he's taking what he knows is going to be that end state that he's got. He's trying to get partners to come in and obviously been very successful at that, who have knowledge about how to do it to help him. He's helping that partnership through IP sharing, right? So he's co-creating because he needs it for his specific concern, but he recognizes that those companies can actually take that, knowledge and now spread it out to other industries. And so he's actually helping the ecosystem, like he's helping beyond his own ecosystem by using partners. I don't think enough companies do that. I think most companies either think, well, I'm just going to hand it all over to a partner and ask them to somehow magically make my mess better. Or they take the flip side of that and say, well, I somehow need to plan for some big day where it all suddenly magically gets replaced. And I think this evolutionary approach of, slowly and over time, in your case, actually pretty fast, Todd, over time, growing it into what you want it to be, to that ambition of what you want it to be in the future state. And I think that's going to happen not just at a company level, not just at an individual partnership level, but I think to what Todd also said, it's going to happen across the industry. It has to happen across the industry because I need the data across the industry to make it all work the best it can. Yeah. So eventually I think you get to the point where lots more partnerships start happening, not just between technology companies and business companies like Estes, but between Estes and other business companies, because now they are starting to look at, wait a minute, if your data and my data came together, look what we could do. And now I get technology, maybe companies who are interested in being able to IP around that thread that now goes way beyond just, what you've got in your particular estate. That's where the real power of it, I think, eventually gets. But I'm also a pragmatist and recognize that there are not a lot of companies doing what Todd's doing, because again, most of them think I need to wait for some magical future state where I have a bucket of money and I can do it all kind of in a big bang way. That's not to say there aren't companies doing it, because there are. They're just, I think there's a lot more of them that are either waiting for something to happen or, they're not doing it in this, I'm just going to go start. And if I start,
the approach makes sense from Todd's perspective.
It does.
Todd, I think this makes a lot of sense. And I love the fact that you mentioned you've got mainframes. I mean, we have this conversation a lot with clients is, everybody 18 months ago was moved to the cloud, lift and shift, everything's going. But, it's like certain things 100% will be more efficient in the cloud, but certain things will always, or at least over the next 5 or 8 years, will be a green screen. And that's 100% okay. How are you making that adjustment to thinking about cloud? And then also with just, a little bit, just 2 minutes left here, is tying into any future state of generative AI. Is that on the docket yet? Because Ola and I would be guilty if we didn't at least ask you that.
Yeah. So I will say yes and yes is a very short answer, right? Like I suspect, like we're an asset heavy company, and Ola kind of alluded to that with the manufacturing space. Like we like to own things too. So cloud and renting and those sorts of things are a bit of a shift, but we need it, right? Like when we're partnering with those outside customers, like a thing like quoting or shipment tracking or those sorts can't go down. and I don't have infinite scalability on site, right? Other things like our pricing systems, our rating systems, like we like to touch those, right?
Yeah.
Generative AI is interesting, John, to kind of pivot for a second. I think there's a million applications for it to make our employees' lives easier, because the vision we've set in IT, quite frankly, is simply make shipping frictionless for our employees and our customers. And generative AI starts to do that. So when we talk about data, like I think the demand for data internal is just as much as it is external, but not everybody knows how to write a SQL statement, right?
Yeah.
Or whatever version of SQL, KSQL, JQL, whatever it is. But giving them the ability to like, I want to know our profitability numbers on shipments from here to here to here to here, and it writes the SQL statement for them. That's a huge win. So we're looking at some of those things, other than me using it to be lazy, right? And write emails and job descriptions and those sorts of things.
Well, Todd, this has been amazing. I appreciate the time. We could easily have gone an hour. There's just so much to learn. Who knew that freight and LTL and Todd and Estes would be this amazingly interesting? So thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you all for having me.
Thanks,
Take
Todd.
care. Ola, wow.
I could have gone on forever.
Yeah,
It's so fascinating. It's just so easy to see his application of what is essentially relatively new emerging technology.
Yeah.
This is not technology that was around. So
yeah, an industry that's not normally, you don't think of like high tech, right? So there's 10,000 trucks, they're moving 60,000 things, but the technology, he sees that value there, and working with a Co-Forge or others to partner. Oh my God, amazing.
Really fascinating. Great show.
Yeah, great. Well, listen, Ola, always great to see you, and I'm looking forward to our next show. Have a great day.
See you next time, John.
Bye-bye.
Bye.